Now, with that in mind, if we move on to the next slide, this is what the Scrum looks like. So you have a product backlog and then you have a sprint planning. Now, as I mentioned before, each one of these sprints, the timeline is usually a couple of weeks. Depending on the size of your organization, it might last up to a month. But for all the companies that I've worked with, it's always been between 1 to 3 weeks. So you plan for what has to be done during the next 2 weeks, and then you have the user story or the backlog that you're supposed to work on, and then you have your team that actually works on it along with the daily scrums. So you have the daily meetings at the same time, and at the end of the sprint, you have the review, and then you ship the part that you coded. Now, when I say you ship the part, I don't mean you necessarily put it in production, but you know that the part is ready to be assembled into the application that you have. So the idea is at the end of every 2 weeks, you have a shippable part of the application that is ready to be deployed. So instead of working a huge application that would have taken a year anyway, now you kind of break it down into things that can be actually shipped in 2 weeks, depending on the priorities that have been set by the product owner and the Scrum Master that you have. That's the idea of Scrum, to break everything down into smaller chunks of code, smaller chunks of tasks, so that everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to do. That's like the methodical part of it, right? You have a method, there's a specific best set of practices that you're following along with the technical side. Because you have a rapid deployment, the moment you write a code, you can actually test it in the dev environment. Now that's where people like me, DevOps, come into the picture. But the idea is you don't really have to wait for a month just to see what you coded right now. If you push the code right now, in matter of minutes, you would actually see that working in the dev environment. So that's the technical side. You have the instant feedback to figure out if you have to move on or, if you have to make some changes to the code that you have right now. Now that's Scrum and Agile in general. Then there is a second method. So Scrum was one of the philosophies or framework. Then you have something called as extreme programming. Now this was one of the first ones. A group of developers came up with it back in 2001. I think the guy was called Kent. So they kind of came up with the idea of agile development. They came up with a set of best practices, and then they even signed a manifest. So they actually came up with a manifest that, these are the things that we should be following in the industry. These are the best practices and these are the principles, and they even signed it. So extreme programming has been around for almost a couple of decades, and Scrum is kind of the next iteration of extreme programming. It's a bit different, but as I said before, majority of the organizations use Scrum programming. So in extreme programming, they came up with, the basic sets of principles like people-centric environment, discipline, and then you have rapid deployment. So project requirements, stories, test cases, task, completion, customer input, iteration planning. Now, both of these things are happening in parallel. So you have project requirements, you have stories, test cases, task, and completion. And at the same time, you have customer input, and at some point you have customer iterations in the meeting. For example, you developed 20% of the application and your end user or your client came back with a better idea, or if they need some modifications. So those are the changes. Then you have your UAT testing, you have client-side UAT testing, and acceptance at the end of it. So extreme programming, the ideas are somewhat similar to Scrum, but at the end of the day, all of these philosophies are trying to make the lives of developers, the end users, better and not compromising on technicalities. Rather, making the shippable product better and faster is the idea. All right, let's move on. Then you have lean programming. So lean principles, even this has been around for a while. So eliminate waste, amplify learning, decide as late as possible, decide as fast as possible, empower the team, build integrity, and see the whole. Yeah, so you could call it a framework, you could call it a philosophy or methodology. Now, it really depends on, the word that you want to use. But at the end of the day, it's again trying to become developer centric and people centric and setting best practices to make sure everyone in the team knows exactly what they're supposed to do. And you have a cross-functional team. When I say cross-functional, essentially, I'm pretty sure if you're watching this video, is because you have some or the other development experience, And if you do, then you would have come across this point, right? When you talk to someone, hey, have you seen that feature? Have you looked at the code? And that guy would be like, that code doesn't concern me. It's none of my concern. I'm working on something completely different. Now, we are used to that sort of development, right? Where people individually know what they're supposed to do, and they're not even worried about what the other person is doing. Now, it's time we actually break the silos. Just because you're not coding that part does not mean that the code does not concern the part of the code that you are writing. So everybody has to come together and work on the same application, which is what you'll call a cross-functional team. In the Scrum example, once you have the user stories and the backlogs that you're supposed to work on in the next 2 weeks, it doesn't really matter what role do you play in the team. It's your team's responsibility to make sure that the task has been completed. And the task has also been designed with the timeline in mind. So it's not like you're expected to do 6 weeks worth of development in 2 weeks. So the task itself is designed with the timeline in mind. And then you have something like Kanban. So Kanban is similar to Scrum. The difference here is, in case of Scrum, you have smaller chunks of backlogs that you're supposed to work on for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. In case of Kanban, it's a continuous process. So there is no such thing as sprint in Kanban. What you do in Kanban is you have a list of tasks that are supposed to be done. And for example, you have something like a whiteboard. You have a build queue, you have a test queue, and you have a ship queue. Now, this is a hypothetical example. You would obviously have plan and the rest of the things. But the point is, you might have 4 things that have to be built, or let's just say 3 services that have to be built. And once the first service has been built, it actually moves on to the testing queue. And then this place is occupied by another service. And once this is done, this is moved on to testing, and this is occupied by another service. Meanwhile, if this testing is done, it will move to the ship queue and it will eventually be shipped. So the idea is whatever tasks have been achieved will be replaced by a new item in the queue. So if you have a build queue, test queue, and ship queue, all of these would be moving parts. So if your job is to build this, and let's say your colleague's job is to test this, the moment you push this first item into the testing queue, another item will replace this first item so that you know what is the next thing that you are supposed to be working on. So Kanban is more like a continuous implementation of the software development. So that's what you mean by agility in general. Even if you think about it, the English word agility means to be really rapid, right? Agility would mean whatever you're doing is happening in rapid successions, right? That's what you mean by agility in general. So in case of development, by bringing agility to your team, you're ensuring that everyone's happy at the end of the day, and you still have a technically smarter team that's able to get instant feedbacks. Now, I'll give you a quick example of this. Now, I'm pretty sure all of us, or at least most of us, are aware about Netflix. Now, you would be surprised to know that Netflix is pushing more than 1,000 changes every day into their productions. If you actually worked at a Netflix development team, you would know that these guys are pushing 1,000 changes in production every day. Now, how do you think that's possible? Obviously, they are not pushing it to production without reviewing it or without testing it. Even with all of those things in place, how are they able to deploy more than 1,000 changes every day? Now, these could be very little changes, like, some UI fixes, some database fixes, some payment processor fixes.